morning students. I welcome all of you in the session of English language. In the earlier sessions, we completed two poems, Song of the Open Road and Indian Weavers. I hope you must be practicing the activities based on the first poem, Song of the Open Road, in your notebook. So today, we are going to discuss all the figures of speech in the second poem, Indian Weavers, written by Sarojini Naidu. So I hope that, I'm sure that you must be having textbook of English language with you. So let us look at the first stanza of the poem, Indian Weavers. So look at the first line from the first stanza, weavers weaving at break of day. So if you look at this line carefully, so here we have two words, weavers weaving. Both the words begin with the same sound, and that is W. Therefore, this line is an example of the figure of speech alliteration. In the same line, we have the figure of speech metaphor also. Because if you look at the last part of the line, the last phrase in the line, at break of day. So the phrase break of day means sunrise or morning. So this phrase is compared, or the time of sunrise, the time of morning is compared with the first stage of the human life, and that is birth. So here we have comparison between two things. The first is morning time, and the second one is the first stage of the human life, that is birth. So here we have the covert comparison, implied comparison without the relational indicators like, as and like, and therefore this line is an example of metaphor. Now let us come to the second line from the first stanza. I read the line, why do you view a garment so gay? In this line also we have two figures of speech. The first is alliteration and the second one is interrogation. Alliteration in the sense that there are two words, garment and gay, which begin with the same sound, and that is G. So the sound G is repeated twice in this line, and therefore this line is an example of the figure of speech alliteration. This line is an example of the figure of speech interrogation, in the sense that because the line is in the form of question. So when the line is in a question form, that line is considered to be an example of the figure of speech interrogation. And therefore, why do you view a garment so gay is an example of the figure of speech interrogation. Now let us come to the third line from the first stanza. I read the line, blue as the wing of Halcyon white. So in this line, we have three figures of speech, alliteration, simile, and also inversion. So alliteration in the sense that we have two words, wing and white. Both the words begin with the same sound, and that is W, and therefore this line is an example of alliteration. In this line, the garment, the color of the garment blue is compared with the wing of the bird kingfisher. So here we have comparison between two different things. The color of the garment blue, and the second one is the wings of the bird kingfisher. So this is explicit comparison with the marker of comparison as and therefore this line is also an example of the figure of speech simile. This line is also an example of the third figure of speech, and that is inversion. In the earlier session, we discussed what is meant by inversion. So inversion is related to the structure of English language when the order of words, the sequence of words is inverted, is changed. In that condition, in that situation, we have the figure of speech inversion. If you look at this line carefully, blue as the wing of Alison Wilde. So here the poet had changed the order of words, and therefore this line is an example of the figure of speech inversion. The correct order of this line should be like this: the wing of Alison Wilde is blue. Now let us come to the second stanza. Look at the first line of the second stanza. In this line also we have two figures of speech. The first is alliteration and the second is metaphor. The words weavers and weaving begin with the same sound, and that is work, and therefore this line is an example of the figure of speech alliteration. In this line also the phrase at fall of night is compared with the significant second stage of the human life, and that is marriage. So it's the covert comparison without the use of relational indicators or markers of comparison. So comparison has been made between two different things. The first one is fall of night, and the second one is second stage of the human life, and therefore this is the example of the figure of speech metaphor. Now let us come to the second line in the same stanza. Why do you view a garment so bright? The line is in a question form. As I told you, when the line or the statement is in the question form, that line or that statement is considered to be an example of the figure of speech interrogation. Let us come to the third line from the second stanza. I read the line: like the plumes of a peacock, purple and green. In this line also we have two figures of speech, alliteration and simile. So I explain first how is this line an example of alliteration. So if you look at this line, there are three words: plumes, peacock and purple. Three words begin with the same sound, and that is p. So the sound p is repeated thrice for 3 times, and therefore this line is also an example of the figure of speech alliteration. This line is also an example of the figure of speech simile, because the color of the garment, purple and green, is compared with the plumes of peacock. So here we have comparison between two things. The first one is the color of the garment purple, and the second one is the plumes of the peacock. And the poet has used the marker of comparison, and that is like. So with the help of like, the comparison has been made between the color of the garment purple and green with the plumes of the peacock. So it's a over comparison, explicit comparison, and therefore this line, like the plumes of a peacock, purple and green, is an example of the figure of speech simile. Now let us come to the third stanza. In the third stanza also we have figures of speech. I read the first line: weavers weaving, salmon and steel. So this line is an example of alliteration and also paradox. Alliteration in the sense that we have two pairs of the words which begin with the same sound. The first pair is weavers and weaving, which begin with the same sound, and that is verb. And the second pair is solemn and still, which begin with the same sound, that is serve, and therefore this line is an example of the figure of speech alliteration in the same line. So I read the line: weavers, weaving, solemn and still. So this line is also an example of paradox. So what is paradox? When something unbelievable, when something absurd, when something contradictory is mentioned in the line of the poem, that line is considered to be an example of the figure of speech paradox. So when there is a paradox in the line of the poem, we find something unbelievable. We cannot believe what the poet mentions in the line of the poem. If you look at this line carefully, weavers, weaving, solemn and still. So the word used by the poet in this line, still, creates contradiction, and therefore this line is an example of the figure of speech paradox, because the weavers are involved in the activity of weaving the fabric, so they cannot be still, and therefore the action, the activity of weaving is going on still. We have the word still in that line, and therefore it creates contradiction in this line. So this line is an example of paradox. So though there is a contradiction, though we cannot believe what the poet says because of the existence of the word still in the line, but when there is a paradox, that line expresses the truth always. And therefore this line, weavers, weaving, solemn and still, is the best example of paradox. Now let us come to the next line. I read the line: what do you view in the moonlight chill? So this line is also example of the figure of speech interrogation, because the line is in the form of question, and therefore this line is an example of interrogation. So whenever there is a question asked by the poet or other speaker in the poem, the line in the form of question is known to be an example of interrogation, and therefore what do you view in the moonlight chill is an example of the figure of speech interrogation. Now let us come to the third line of the third stanza. I read the line: white as a feather and white as a cloud. So in this line also we have two figures of speech. If you look at this line carefully, so the word white is repeated for 2 times. Let us look at the line: white as a feather and white as a cloud. So the word white occurs twice in this line, and therefore this line is an example of the figure of speech repetition. So what did we study in the repetition? When a word or a phrase is repeated twice, thrice or number of times in the line of the poem, that line is considered to be an example of repetition, and we have the repetition of the word white in this line for 2 times, and therefore this line is an example of the figure of speech repetition. In the same line, we have the figure of speech simile also. So if you focus on the line white as a feather and white as a cloud, so the color of the garment of white is compared with a feather and a cloud. So the comparison has been made between 2 different things. The first is the color white. The color of the garment white is compared with a feather and a cloud, and therefore it's a overt comparison. the comparison is made explicitly, it's explicit comparison, and therefore this line, white as a feather and white as a cloud, is the best example of the figure of speech simile. So this is how we have discussed all the figures of speech which are there in the poem Indian Weavers, written by Sarojini Naidu. So let me speak on the rhyme scheme of this poem. So if you look at all the lines, 3 stanzas of the poem. So for example, let us take the first stanza. If you concentrate, if you focus on the first 2 lines of the first stanza, I read both the lines. Weavers weaving at break of day, why do you view a garment so gay? The first line of the first stanza ends with the word day, and the second line ends with the word gay. So the sound, the last sound of the word day rhymes with the last sound with the word gay, and therefore the first line rhymes with the second line. Now let us look at the third and fourth line. The third line ends with the word wild, and the fourth line ends with the word child. So the word wild rhymes with the word child, so we can say that third line rhymes with the line fourth, and therefore the first stanza has the rhyme scheme as A, B, B, day, gay, wild, child. The second stanza and third stanza have the same rhyme scheme, that is A, B, B. If you look at the second stanza and third stanza, so each stanza has the same rhyme scheme, that is A, B, B. So I hope that you must have understood all the figures of speech from the poem Indian Weavers, written by Sarojini Naidu. I am also sure that you must have got an idea about the rhyme scheme which exists in the poem Indian Weavers in all the stanzas, 3 stanzas of the poem. So you write down all the lines of the poem and find out the figures of speech from the poem, from the lines of the poem. So I stop here. Thank you.